was a night like any other, or so I thought. After a long day of meetings and deadlines, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The city was alive with its usual nighttime buzz, the distant sound of traffic, the occasional honk, and the faint chatter of late-night wanderers. I had done this countless times before, wandering the streets to gather my thoughts, but tonight felt different. I ventured towards an area I rarely explored, a part of the city that was a mix of old warehouses and newly sprouting trendy cafes. It had an eclectic charm, with graffiti art covering the walls and ivy creeping up the buildings. As I walked, I admired the juxtaposition of old and new, feeling oddly adventurous. The streets were narrow here, with the occasional alley cutting through blocks, creating a labyrinthine layout. I was in the midst of my thoughts when I noticed an alleyway I hadn't seen before. It was darker than the others, the dim streetlights barely reaching into its depths. Curiosity piqued. I paused. Something about the alley drew me in, a combination of mystery and a slight thrill. I hesitated, then stepped into the shadows. The air was cooler in the alley, carrying a damp, earthy smell. As I walked further in, the sounds of the city faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The buildings on either side loomed over me, their windows dark and uninviting. I could hear my own breathing, a soft crunch of gravel underfoot, and nothing else. It was as if I had stepped into another world, cut off from the city just a few steps away. About halfway down the alley, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, a subtle scuffling sound. I stopped, straining to hear. There it was again, closer this time, like something, or someone, moving just out of sight. My heart began to race. I scanned the shadows, my eyes adjusting to the dimness, but I saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow darted from one side of the alley to the other, disappearing behind a dumpster. My skin prickled with a cold sweat. I took a cautious step back, suddenly regretting my decision to explore this dark passage. The rational part of my mind told me it was probably just a stray cat or a gust of wind, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I turned to leave, my steps hurried when I heard it again, a distinct, deliberate shuffle. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, and there, at the far end of the alley, stood a figure. Cloaked in shadows, I couldn't make out any details, just a tall, dark silhouette. It stood motionless, watching me. Panic surged through me. I took another step back, eyes locked on the figure. My breath quickened, and my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Who was this person? What were they doing here? More importantly, why were they just standing there, staring? My fight-or-flight response kicked in, and I chose flight. I turned and bolted down the alley, my footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow space. I didn't dare look back, the sound of my own breathing and pounding heart drowning out everything else. I reached the mouth of the alley and burst into the street, the sudden noise and light disorienting me. I kept running, not stopping until I was several blocks away in a more familiar, well-lit area. I slowed to a walk, trying to catch my breath, my mind reeling from what just happened. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me, but the street was mercifully empty. I continued home, my nerves still on edge. That night, as I locked my door and double-checked the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even as I lay in bed, the image of the dark figure haunted me. I tried to rationalize it, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew I had seen something real. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I returned to the alley in the daylight. It looked so ordinary, a mundane passageway lined with dumpsters and graffiti. But as I walked down its length, a chill ran down my spine. There, near the spot where I had seen the figure, was a message scrawled in chalk on the ground. Some things are better left in the shadows. I left quickly, the city's daylight failing to banish the sense of dread that had settled in my bones. Since then, I've avoided that part of town, preferring the familiar safety of well-lit streets. But every now and then, I catch myself glancing down dark alleys, half expecting to see a shadowy figure watching from the darkness. It was one of those nights when the city felt alive, pulsing with energy yet strangely desolate. I had just finished a late shift at the cafe and decided to walk home instead of catching the last bus. It wasn't a long walk, just 20 minutes through familiar streets. But something felt off. Maybe it was the moonless sky or the slight chill in the air, but an inexplicable sense of unease settled over me as I started my journey. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an eerie stillness. Streetlights cast long shadows, making the dark spaces between them seem even darker. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, shivering more from the atmosphere than the cold. As I walked, my footsteps echoed off the surrounding buildings, creating a rhythm that was oddly comforting. I had always loved these walks, finding them a perfect way to unwind. But tonight, everything felt different. The familiar graffiti on the walls, the dimly lit storefronts, all seemed shrouded in an uncanny aura. About halfway home, I passed by an old, abandoned theater. It was a relic of the past, its boarded-up windows and decaying facade, a stark contrast to the modern city around it. I usually avoided looking at it, but tonight, something drew my attention. There, in the shadows of the theater's entrance, I thought I saw a figure. It was just a glimpse, a flicker of movement, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I stopped and squinted into the darkness, but saw nothing. Probably just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought, quickening my pace. But then I heard it, a faint, almost inaudible whisper. "Hey!" I froze. The voice was barely more than a breath, carried on the wind. I turned, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one. The street was empty, the silence only broken by the distant hum of traffic. I started walking again, faster this time, my senses on high alert. "Hey, you..." There it was again, clearer now, like someone was right next to me. My heart raced, a cold sweat forming on my brow. I turned around, scanning the area. Still, no one. Panic began to rise in my chest. I couldn't explain the whispers, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get home, and fast. I broke into a jog, the once comforting sound of my footsteps now a frenzied staccato. The whispers seemed to follow me, growing louder with each step. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see a figure trailing me, but the street remained empty. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. As I rounded the corner to my street, I heard the whisper again, right by my ear. "Don't turn around." That was it. I sprinted the last few yards to my apartment building, practically throwing myself through the front door. I slammed it shut, panting, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. After a few minutes, I gathered the courage to peek through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the silence felt menacing. I quickly turned on every light in my apartment, the harsh brightness a welcome contrast to the oppressive darkness outside. I stood in the middle of my living room, feeling the walls close in around me. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispers had stopped, but the air was still thick with an unexplainable tension. I checked and rechecked the locks, my paranoia growing with each passing hour. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep on the couch, the lights still blazing. The next morning, the city felt normal again, almost mocking in its everyday normality. I left for work, trying to shake off the lingering dread. But as I passed the abandoned theater, I couldn't resist a quick glance at the entrance. There, on the dusty ground, were fresh footprints leading into the shadows, far too large to be mine. It was one of those nights where the world seemed to be wrapped in a blanket of stillness, the kind of night where even the air felt heavy and the darkness seemed thicker than usual. I had just finished a long day at work and decided to take my usual late-night walk to clear my head. Walking always helped me unwind, and my quiet suburban neighborhood felt like the safest place in the world. The streets were empty, as they usually were at this hour. The occasional chirp of a cricket and the distant hum of streetlights were the only sounds accompanying me. I started my walk down the familiar path, passing rows of houses, each with their lights off, their inhabitants sound asleep. I turned onto a narrow street that led to a small, community-maintained park. It was a shortcut I often took, despite the eerie feeling it sometimes gave me. Something about the dense trees and shadows played tricks on the mind, but I enjoyed the solitude. As I walked deeper into the park, the air grew cooler and the sounds of the city faded. I felt an odd sense of peace. That was until I noticed a rustling in the bushes to my left. My heart skipped a beat. Probably just a raccoon or some other nocturnal critter, I told myself. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A shuffling sound, unmistakably human. I stopped and turned, straining to see through the thick darkness. There was nothing, just the wind gently moving the leaves. I shook off the uneasy feeling and continued walking. But now my senses were heightened. Every crackle of leaves, every shadow seemed more sinister. The park, which usually felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the safety of the main street. Just as I was about to leave the park, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head, and there, partially obscured by the shadows, was a figure. It was a man, standing still, watching me. My stomach dropped. He was too far away for me to make out any details, but the outline was clear enough. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and seemed almost blended into the night. I didn't want to panic, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. Instead, I decided to play it cool. Maybe he was just another late-night walker like me, right? But as I continued on my path, I glanced back and saw him still standing there, unmoving, staring. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I walked faster, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the edge of the park, I turned around one last time. The man was gone. Relieved, I stepped out onto the street, the familiar orange glow of the streetlights giving me a sense of safety. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to paranoia. But just as I was about to relax, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in the quiet night. I turned, and there he was, emerging from the shadows of the park, walking towards me. This time, there was no mistaking his intent. He wasn't just another walker. He was following me. Panic surged through me. I broke into a run, my feet pounding the pavement, the sound of my breath loud in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know how close he was. My only thought was to get home, to safety. I reached my front door, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking. As I pushed the door open and slammed it shut behind me, I dared a glance through the peephole. The street was empty, the figure nowhere in sight. I locked the door and double-checked the windows. My heart was still racing, my mind replaying the events over and over. The next morning, I hesitantly stepped outside. The street looked so normal, so peaceful, Had it all been my imagination, a figment of a tired mind? But as I glanced down the street, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A single dark footprint on my driveway, leading away from my door. If you want to see more horror stories, check out my next video.